Hi, I'm Meta
Okay.
Spencer. I'm in Toronto and I'm with some friends who are in Ottawa and I think London and Brighton. Oh, well, anyway, she's in England. And today we're going to talk about development economics, how to finance all of the projects that need to be done to help countries get caught up in this world economically. And this is not a topic about which I have much expertise whatsoever. But so I brought in two people who really have tons of expertise, who've worked in the area for many, many years and who know each other and who can talk to each other. And I'm going to just be a kind of an audience along with you because I need to learn some things. So, our speakers, I guess, today are Roy Culpepper, whom I do know. I know him as the head of the Group of 78 in Ottawa, to which I belong, but he's also an academic and he says he's not work. He said, I'm not working either on finance or on money or for money. And I
For
didn't,
money.
for money.
For
Okay.
money.
Okay, very good. And in Brighton, in England, is Stephanie Griffiths Jones. Who wants to start us off by just giving a basic orientation toward this topic and what your own particular interests are?
Well, maybe I should start since I'm the guilty party of bringing this together. Um, Development financing is not nearly as complicated a subject as some of its proponents and practitioners might have us believe. Most of what we call development projects or development strategies is financed essentially from domestic resources. In other words, the savings and the investments of people in individual countries. A small part of it is financed through foreign aid and foreign investment and foreign loans. But the problem with increasing dependence on foreign sources of financing is that it can lead to debt. And debt can lead to financial problems and can lead to breakdowns between creditors and debtors. And that's the position that we find ourselves in today. There's a huge wave of debt, the fourth wave of debt in the past 4 decades, actually, that is cresting and because of the pandemic is about to burst. In fact, some countries are already in default. So basically, we're concerned with the whole spectrum of these issues. On the one hand, how do you finance development? And on the other hand, what are the implications of how you finance development? And in particular, how can you deal with debt problems when they arise? Because they seem to arise with astonishing regularity, and their consequences are quite severe. They can lead to years and years of lost income and employment. It can, like the current debt problem, is thought to be increasing the number of people in extreme poverty in developing countries to the tune of 100 million people.
And when you say they default, I imagine you're talking about government to government debt. We're not talking here about loans to corporations or farmers or anything directly. Is that right? Or is it we're talking about intergovernmental financing
Not
or not?
Stephanie.
Yeah, I was just going to make a point which links very nicely with your interesting question that there are two ways of development finance. One, both domestically and internationally. One is private and one is public. And in the era of what was called the Washington Consensus, it became fashionable to argue that only private finance was efficient. It was called the efficient private market theory. And therefore, public finance was greatly discouraged. And both on the debtor and on the creditor side, and also domestically. So all sorts of freedom was given to the private domestic financial system, which was liberalized. Interest rates were liberalized. All barriers to capital flows, private capital flows, were reduced. And that led, as Roy has just said, to a number of financial and debt crises. This last crisis is actually not so much the fault of the financial system because it's the fault of this terrible virus, but practically all previous financial crises have been actually caused by the financial sector themselves, by their tendency to overlend and then underlend, these sort of boom-bust cycles. Whereas, and therefore many of us think that private financial markets have a lot of limitations, and therefore, they should be regulated so they don't have such excessive booms and busts and don't lead to these very costly development crises and poverty, leading to poverty, which Roy mentioned. Totally correct.
Yeah.
Or we should have a more mixed system where we have a greater role for public finance, government finance.
Okay. The first thing that I wonder is if you want to regulate it, isn't that sort of like regulating the stock market or something? You don't really have control, do you? I mean, or predictive ability. You say that they overlend. Well, is it really clear what should be lent and what is an overlending situation? How scientific, so to speak, is the information about what's a good investment and what's a good loan and what's a risky one?
Well, and probably Roy wants to compliment because he's thought a lot about this too. It's true that there is uncertainty about the future and there's risk in the future, so nobody has a clear answer. But there are two issues. One is the quantities of lending, and one is, as you rightly ask, about the projects. Both are very important. In terms of the quantity, I think you do know when credit starts increasing at a very high pace, it usually ends in tears. And so, as the former governor of the US Fed once said, you have to take away the punch bowl when the party's at its best. So a good
I love that. I'll let you remember that one.
So a good regulator would see this very high growth of credit compared to the growth of the real economy, the high levels of debt, and would say, no, this is too much. You banks have to provision more against it. You have to have higher capital, and you could even restrict the lending. Or in the case of the recipient countries, they can have what we call capital controls to discourage excessive lending. So a good regulator should take a macro position and do this. And this has been done many times, and it can work. But of course, the private sector doesn't like it because the private sector wants to make short-term profits. So they always fight back.
Just
so
to
please.
Just to complement what Stephanie said, in fact, if you look at history, the first 25 or 30 years after the Second World War, we had an international system in which it was recognized that governments and states had a legitimate reason and the right to restrict financial flows because they were seen to be destabilizing and unpredictable. And that regime, that history, was based on the collective memory of the interwar period between the First and Second World War, when there was a lot of financial turmoil, precisely because finance was not inhibited in flowing from one country to another. So we have a history, in fact, that suggests that it's possible, and it's also very not profitable, but very stabilizing to restrict international capital flows. It's not just an idea or a theory.
How do you do it? The only thing that I've heard that sounds at all like that is when people talk about Tobin taxes, that it's not only a good way to collect money for good purposes, but that it reduces the sloshing of money around the world. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about, or is that a totally different matter?
I've actually done a lot of work on the Tobin tax. I'm a big fan. So I'm delighted you mentioned it. I think the Tobin tax, or that kind of financial transaction taxes more generally, is a very good instrument, but it doesn't. It's not specific enough. I think it needs to be complemented by financial regulation, which looks at the type of flows, possibly also, as you indicated before, where the money is going. Are there good projects or not? But broadly, you need more detailed regulation. But I think the Tobin tax is a brilliant idea. It's almost always been about to be approved, and then the pushback from the financial sector becomes too strong. And it has been difficult to do. The European Union, about 10 countries had reached in principle an agreement, and they have put on in countries like Italy and France a certain level of Tobin tax.
Could an individual country, France being one, do it all alone? I figured it would be something you'd have to have a global agreement to make it work.
Well, you can do it. That's for a currency tax, which was Tobin's original idea. But you can also regulate your domestic finance. And for that, you can do it in a country level. Curiously, the United Kingdom, which is such a big defender of free capital, has had for about 300 years a stamp duty on selling stocks and shares, which is very successful. It raises at least £4 billion a year, which is a lot of money, of tax, and it does discourage the most open kinds of speculation. New York has a small tax on stocks and shares.
I'm surprised that Stephanie hasn't brought up the example of Chile, which had its own short-term tax on capital inflows. And that was important and effective because some of the most volatile inflows and outflows of finance are short-term inflows and outflows. So not only Chile, but other countries, I think Colombia was one of them, have had similar taxes. So there are ways of doing this, but Meta is right in suggesting that if you don't have broad international buy-in, it becomes less effective. The best of all worlds would be if all countries or most countries agreed that these kinds of restraints on financial flows were stabilizing and helpful to all countries, and agreed on implementing them.
You say that sometimes we've gotten close to having it put into effect, but it always falls through. That's my impression. How might, if you're really an activist trying to promote this, how would you go about trying to get it adopted? And what are the pitfalls? Who's messing it up at the last minute?
Well, I think, if you want to get it adopted, you really need to get the big financial centers to do it. So you would need to get the US administration and the UK, because those are in terms of currency markets, those are the two largest currency markets. I think if they did it properly, a full Tobin tax on currencies, that would help. And you don't actually have to have it in all countries, because then you can tax more flows that come from jurisdictions that are not imposing the tax themselves. So you could, for example, double the tax for those. Say US and UK do it, but France doesn't. So if there's an inflow from France, you just tax it more. So there are ways of getting around it, I think.
If I may take another tack at this, the other approach to bringing the financial sector to be a part of the solution of development and part of the problem through debt, for example, is to rely more on internal or domestic resources. And this is something that actually Stephanie's been working on quite a lot. She's been looking at public development banks as intermediaries that are domestically based and can finance development, finance investment in their own countries. And in fact, a large number of countries going back a long time, a century, I would say, have had these public development banks. Countries like Germany have had the KfW, Japan has had its own development bank, Korea, China's got a few of them. So these are examples of institutions and countries that have actually worked very well to harness savings and investment from internal or domestic resources instead of going outside to foreign investment and foreign credit, which has its pitfalls, as we were saying.
I think Roy's completely right. I mean, most of the resources have to come from the country domestically. And one very effective way of doing that, on which Roy himself did a lot of research, but I've been working a lot on recently, is having these public development banks, which have two advantages. One is they can lend what economists call counter-cyclically. So when there is, for example, a downturn or financial crisis, the private banks don't want to know you. They're fair weather friends. But the public development bank can step in and lend in difficult times and therefore maintain levels of investment or help maintain and actually help the economy recover. And the other thing is that if a country has a vision, for example, now most countries have a vision, they want to transform their economies to be more low carbon, more green, and also fairer, more inclusive.
Or the SDGs.
To meet exactly the sustainable development goals. Then in that case, you need a sort of instrument, a public instrument that can help channel both public and private money into projects to make the economy greener and fairer. If the government doesn't have instruments, it can just make a plan, but it doesn't have ways of implementing it, or has to try and coax the private sector to do it indirectly through regulation. But if it has a good public development bank, like the case of the KfW that Roy mentioned,
KW?
KfW, Credit for Wiederaufbau, Credit for Rebuilding Germany. This was a bank that was actually funded by the Americans as part of the Marshall Plan. But they've used it for development purposes, for domestic development after they rebuilt. And so then the minister can just phone up and say, look, I want you to lend more into green projects, into renewables. And they just do it. You don't have to coax them or regulate them or, just work with them.
Even Canada has a small example of a public development bank. It's called Business Development Canada. It's wholly owned by the federal government. It lends to small and medium-sized enterprises, and it has a reputation of turning in a profit every year, which goes to the federal treasury. So this is very much part of the institutional infrastructure of the Canadian financial system.
I'm not aware of that. Last week, I had a talk show with Derek Paul. You may know him, Roy. He's an amateur economist, I would say. He's really a physicist, but he actually has some very interesting ideas that he's picked up here and there. And we talked, one of the things we discussed was public banks, which I asked about. And I don't know that we're talking about the same thing, because I think his book referred to the notion of more closer to being like a regular bank, but owned by the public or the government. I've heard people say that every post office should be really a little bank, and that ordinary people could do their financial transactions when they buy their stamps. So I don't know whether that is connected to this development bank that you're talking about. Well, that sounds very big and public. But can you? And the other thing that I'm wondering is, what's the difference between that and something like the Grameen banks, which are supposedly funding, women with $25 loans or something if they want to set up a stall or buy a sewing machine or something. Go on.
They can be some public development banks lend either directly or indirectly through commercial banks or cooperative banks to very poor people, what's called inclusive finance, or to very small companies, because a lot of poor people work in small companies. And so you can micro enterprises or SMEs. And so that's one area of the work that development banks can do. Other areas are much bigger in the sense of they can finance infrastructure. They can say, we think we should have much more solar energy in this country, or hydrogen, or wind. And therefore, they can help fund these kind of projects. There's, in fact, a discussion beginning in the US about creating a public development bank or perhaps a green bank. And we may see in the next half of 1 year, the Biden administration, of a creation of such a bank. Probably would be focused on infrastructure and particularly green one, but also on poor communities, on this idea of inclusiveness, of helping small entrepreneurs develop. So they can do different kind of things. They can also support innovation. One of the best vaccines in the world, Pfizer, was funded by the European Investment Bank, which is the public bank of the EU, and rightly so, because they're supposed to be funding innovation that is for the public good. They don't look so much at the profit. They want companies that are profitable, and as Roy said, often development banks have profit, but that's not their main purpose. They're profit making, but not profit maximizing. Their main purpose is sort of public good, if you like.
I keep my money in something that used to be a credit union. And I don't know whether it still calls itself a credit union, but it does what ordinary banks do, I think. What's the difference between a credit union and what you're talking about, the kind of public bank? Are they similar?
Credit unions have similarities with what you were mentioning, that is postal savings banks, which were very common in the early post-war years. They've tended to be folded and done away with. There's still a few around, but I think both of these institutions, postal savings banks and credit unions, serve their communities, their immediate communities, by providing deposit and lending facilities for households and consumers who don't have huge sums of money to invest, but they have their own family savings, and so they build a relationship with their communities and provide loans and mortgages like some banks do. What's missing, we say quite often, is on the one hand you have these smaller banks, including banks like the Grameen Bank, that aim at family lending or even small loan lending to individual women, just a few dollars, or a few $100 perhaps. So that's micro lending. And then on the other hand, you have the established financial commercial banks, which specialize in large scale lending. And you have something in the middle, the missing middle, of medium and smaller scaled enterprises, which are too big for NGO type of lending that the Grameen Bank provides on the one hand, and the large loans that large commercial banks provide.
Are you proposing this is a need that people better start filling, create more medium-sized banks?
Well, no, I think Roy was talking more about borrowers, medium-sized borrowers. And I mean, these development banks are not marginal actors. I mean, we just had this major conference that was sponsored by President Macron and the UN Secretary General, and we counted that there are 450 development banks. If you take the multilateral ones, the regional ones, on which Roy did some very interesting research, and the national ones. And in total, the assets are over $11 trillion. $11 trillion, and they lend each year about just under $2.5 trillion, which funds about 10%. Sorry, so my last number, 10% of world investment. So they are quite, significant actors.
I wasn't aware. Yeah.
In Germany, in China, in Brazil, they're like very important in France, and so what we concluded at this conference was that all countries really should have one, and that they should be bigger and of course better run and so on. You can do other improvements. There's a debate also about how they should interact with the private sector. I mean, there's an agreement that they can catalyze additional money from the private sector. But then very conservative or free market economists want these public banks to what they call de-risk for the private sector. That means the public bank takes all guarantees the risks, and the private sector makes a profit. and a lot of but a lot of important institutions and economists say this. But people like Roy and me or Stiglitz think that that is completely wrong, that we should have a balance. So, for example, if a bank takes some risks away from the private sector, it should also have, for example, a share of the profits through equity. So. Exactly. So it has to be like fair. Because if not, it becomes a ripoff.
So yeah, I'm just trying to understand now. A development bank, I had assumed it would be trying to get profits, but then I don't know what you would do with it. Is this? It's not profits for let's say the public that whoever owns this bank would get like dividend checks or what? I would have assumed that it would be a non-profit kind of operation where you're trying to make a profit, but you're trying to take all the money you can that would be profits and put it out as development loans.
Exactly. All the profits would typically go into recapitalizing the bank, making it bigger so it can lend more. That's exactly right.
Okay. So the unfair question has to do with the allocation of risk between public and private.
Yes, I can answer that, but maybe I think Roy wanted to add something.
Yeah.
Well, when we were talking about having this conversation, I mentioned to Meta, I'd just been on a panel talking about blended finance, which is another variant of what Stephanie was just talking about. Except in this case, blended finance refers to a blend of foreign aid or ODA, official development assistance on the one hand, and private finance through commercial banks in the form of loans. But the idea is the same, that the risk is borne by the aid part of the deal, and the rewards, the profits, the interest rates are earned by the private part of the group that puts these blended finance packages together. And there's a few things wrong with this picture, and we mentioned some of them already. But one of them appears to be, since these kind of blended finance deals have been going on for 8 or 9 years now, that it seems to attract money away from the poorest countries and the poorest people towards the higher income developing countries, to projects that are of less interest to the poorest communities in those countries. Energy projects, for example, instead of agriculture projects. So there are a number of issues that arise when these blended finance proposals and programs get unveiled. And the final problem with them, I suppose, is that they're a way of rich countries, aid donors, saying, well, we can't afford any more aid, but we've got this blended finance program which will add to the amount of money that we can bring to the table. We can provide whatever aid that we have, or scarce aid, and then top that up with private financing. And it's a way of basically skipping out on the obligation of donor countries to provide more aid, which they, in Canada's case, we've been refusing to do for the past 10 years. We've been frozen in our, ODA to GNI ratio at around 0.3%. So a lot of people look at blended finance and say, instead of using these gimmicks, we should be increasing our aid contributions. That's really what we should be doing.
Well, let me get clarity on this, because when you talk about money being siphoned away from the poorest countries to the better developing countries, that means that the whole system is run transnationally, right? Mm-hmm. Is this some sort of international organization that's allocating loans and money. Or I would have assumed that you were talking about blended finance within each country, that each country would have its own system, and then you wouldn't have that problem, would you?
Well, you have international organizations, sorry, like you have the International Monetary Fund, which lends for balance of payments purposes, and you have the World Bank, which is a public multilateral development bank, and then you have the regional development banks, like the Inter-American Development Bank or the African or the Asian one, and they are playing a lot with this blended finance now. So they are, but they are basically public development banks at either a world level or a regional level. And then the blended finance is provided, as Roy said, from the aid budgets of these countries, who then love it because they, like the World Bank says, we're going to transform billions into trillions. Yeah, but it's a little bit of an illusion because first, it doesn't happen. And secondly, you have to do all this kind of de-risking, which means that you give them guarantees. And then if there are losses, it's the World Bank or the Regional Development Bank that will take the hit. And in the end, it might turn out even more expensive for the taxpayers than actually giving aid, which can be channeled to, as Roy says, to the most needy countries and the most needy people and the best projects. So it's how much, even in this public sphere, you want to allow private criteria, short-term profit maximization criteria, or whether you want to have kind of broad development criteria.
And this is all happening at a time when total debt is increasing at a really dangerous speed. And right now, the overall debt to GDP ratio of developing countries is almost at 200%. In other words, they owe twice as much as their aggregate gross national income. So this is not the first time that debt has become a problem, but this is the World Bank has identified this as the fourth wave of debt that has taken place since let's say the 1980s. And the advent of the pandemic is the kind of thing that's going to push a lot of countries over into debt default. There's already been some countries such as Zambia that have defaulted on their debt. So this is going to happen more and more as these countries get squeezed between paying their debt on the one hand and meeting their obligations as governments, to providing vaccine to their populations and other health and education services.
So well, the thing that I've been hearing about lately having to do with the large, for example, the big bill that just passed Congress in the US, where they're going to spend tons of money that they don't have, that there's a real question as to whether that's going to cause catastrophic inflation, right? Now, that's about the US, but I haven't heard anybody talking about the impact on poor countries. Tell me, I presume that the notion is that all countries, let's say above a certain median income, should do aid, provide ODA, and that other countries that are below a certain line should be recipients or something like that. How is that worked out? Is there some sort of international agreement about what countries should be doing by way of providing aid, or and how many countries actually provide any aid, and if so, what countries receive it?
Well, the framework in which these rules and issues is discussed is the Development Assistance Committee of the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And they have rules and guidelines for the kinds of questions you just asked, which are observed in the breach. For example, there are still aid flows going to countries like China and India, and some people might consider, neither India nor China should at this stage be aid recipients. But there are political motivations for providing aid, which often interfere with these high principles of who should and maybe should not be receiving aid. So that's the system in place. And it's worse than that because one of the biggest providers of development assistance today is China. And China isn't part of this conversation. It's not a member of the Development Assistance Committee or the OECD. So coordinating relief on Chinese debt with relief on other debt is a real challenge. And the G20 is grappling with this and trying to bring China into the picture, which I think is a very important and necessary thing to do.
You want to get China into the OECD?
Well, that would be a bridge too far. I don't think that's going to happen anytime too soon. But at least they could talk the same language in terms of common issues. Climate change, for example, we have every incentive to work with China to make sure that we're, battling against greenhouse gas pollution and so forth. And you could say the same for global financial stability. We should all be working hand in hand to make sure that we're helping and not undermining the cause of global financial stability.
For example, it's very important to involve China because if you look at, I'm just writing a paper on debt in Africa. The rising share of Chinese exposure to Africa is dramatic, also in terms of Latin America. But in China, it's been a major sea change, and they've become bigger creditors than many of the traditional creditors, like the European countries and so on. They're after the World Bank, they're the biggest creditors in Africa, I think. And so, as Roy says, you have to kind of bring them in, coordinate with them. There is, for example, an organization called the Paris Club, which coordinates reduction of debt, of official bilateral debt. And they are not part of it, but there's increasingly close collaboration. I mean, in some ways, sometimes the Chinese can be quite generous and they have given quite a lot of debt relief. But they have, for example, and they're not very transparent about it, when they, for example, build a port in a poor African country, they will not say, okay, you have to service the debt, that'll be very nice. They say, you're going to export copper out of this port. And so when you sell the copper, a part of the proceeds will go not directly into your central bank, but it will come directly into the accounts of the Chinese finance ministry. So the money is actually sort of mortgaged to be paid automatically. And that kind of debt is then very difficult to restructure. And a lot of the Chinese so-called development banks, which do a lot of good things, but is in that modality of linking the proceeds of the exports into what's called escrow accounts, which go directly paid to Chinese. Then how can you restructure your debt? How can you stop paying your debt, as countries do when they're desperate, if the money is not even in your central bank?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But Stephanie, I mean, we've had a history of doing similar sorts of things.
Of course, totally.
Through the export credit agencies, which exist to boost exports to developing countries, and the profits come back to Canada. So it's
that's right, but they don't actually have usually escrow accounts where they go automatically. No, that's a bit extreme. Mm-hmm. But of course, in many ways, in many things that we criticize in the Chinese, Roy is totally right. It's when they do things that are similar to what, say, Europeans and Americans did in Africa themselves. But they are the new kid on the block. Mm-hmm. But I think it's very important to keep the dialogue with them. They're good on certain things, like in certain aspects of climate change. And here I come back a bit to my favorite topic on development banks. It was first the German development bank, but then the Chinese development bank that promoted the massive creation of solar energy and the production of solar panels. And at this large Chinese scale, these solar panels became very cheap and competitive with fossil fuel production of electricity. And so they did a tremendous good, not just for China, but for the world, because now in most countries in the world, solar energy is cheaper sometimes than fossil fuel. So so they can do very valuable things. At the same time, they're still burning a lot of coal because they have a lot of coal. So it's very important to have a dialogue with them. And I think it should, in theory, be easier because with Trump, there was not a possibility of a dialogue because he was, had this America first. And possibly with Biden, although they're also quite strongly, I would say, a little bit conflictual with China, and as are the Europeans. But there's much more possibility, I think, of a dialogue on these important topics like climate change, which is perhaps the big challenge for the world.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, normally now when you hear the words China and the U.S. in the same sentence, it's always referring to some sort of competition or conflict. And yet, when you say we ought to have a dialogue about development projects and so on, that sounds as if there's a range of activities that are not necessarily competitive. I can't imagine, for example, why two different countries would be competing to see who gets to aid a certain underdeveloped country. It's not a competitive situation, but exactly. Am I wrong?
Well, they sometimes compete for political influence because, like with the Soviets, during the Cold War, they want to lend a lot, say, to some countries because they want their backing in the UN, to keep Taiwan out, or they want to sell goods to them. They are the emerging power, and so they want to garner influence. So in that sense, there is competition, but it should be healthy competition as well. And it can benefit actually the poorer countries because if both the Chinese, the Europeans, and the Americans are offering them something at the same time, this strengthens the bargaining position of the borrowing country.
And another element of this competition, which Stephanie was talking about, relates to conditionality or policy conditionality. Many of the institutions and financial agencies we've been talking about, the IMF and the World Bank, when they provide assistance, they say, they lay out a series of terms and conditions, which going back a ways were referred to as the Washington Consensus. If you get aid from the World Bank and the IMF, you have to run a budget under these kinds of conditions, and you have to do this or that. Policy conditionality is very much at the heart of the Western approach to development, whereas the Chinese have not tended to go down that road. And this makes the Chinese more appealing as a development partner to many African countries, which have welcomed the Chinese as competitors on the aid bloc.
Yeah. When you say conditionality, what kinds of conditions? I assume that from what I remember, for the term Washington Consensus, it was like an imposition of austerity on countries that maybe didn't need austerity at that point. Tell me about that. Is that still going on, or have the World Bank and the IMF changed their positions on that?
Well, I think to a certain extent they have tried to reduce. They not only impose austerity, which is a very important aspect, and not just in developing countries. They did it together with the European Commission and the Germans during the Eurozone crisis. I mean, the austerity that they imposed on Greece was so awful. The GDP fell over 25%. The levels of increases of poverty and so on were incredible for a developed country. So I think in Africa, I have the impression that the IMF has mellowed a bit. I think. But the other aspect of the IMF and the World Bank is all those sort of structural conditions which they ask. They want things to be privatized. They want capital accounts to be liberalized, although the IMF's got to be better on that. They want, completely free trade. They want some kind of taxation that not always is progressive. So they impose a lot of free market ideology. That, I think, has been restricted, at least officially, for the IMF. They have said that they will not go into these more structural conditions. But it's not so clear that in the practice they've done what they have promised.
Tell me about, I don't want to use the word corruption, but there's another term I can't think of, where the problem for a country is that they can't collect enough taxes because people take their money and put it in the Cayman Islands or something, and simply don't pay their taxes. To what extent is that a major factor in securing the capital that a country needs for development? And to what extent is this just a trivial matter?
Well, it's certainly not trivial. It's a significant challenge that I would say not only developing countries, but developed countries also face. You know, there's huge tax hemorrhaging that takes place out of Canada, out of the United States, out of Europe, into tax havens. Sometimes tax havens can be within a country, you know, and the state of Delaware or the state of South Dakota could be a tax haven, and they do act in that way. So this isn't something that afflicts only developing countries. There are some international initiatives that are aimed at bringing the tax havens to heel, and this is a challenge because it requires close cooperation between all of the major countries in order to make this happen. And the major countries compete among each other to try and attract capital rather than scare it away. So, lower corporate tax rates, for example. But there's one thing that seems to be coming more and more into vogue, and that is when you have multinational corporations with production facilities and operations in a number of countries, the way that they have tended to account for their activities in the past has been to globally consolidate everything into one account. And that really pulls the rug from under countries that would like to tax the operations of multinational in their own country because there's no basis on which to do it. And there's a movement now towards country by country reporting by multinational corporations, which would enable every country to assess tax on those branch plants in their own country. And I think this would be a huge source of revenue particularly for developing countries. And, it also is a consequence of the kinds of investment treaties that have been signed between rich countries and developing countries, which have tried to seek good conditions for investors of the developed country partner, tax holidays or tax incentives. So all of these things need to be addressed, not just the corruption issue to which you alluded, but the fluidity of finance between borders, which was the beginning of this conversation, affects every country's fiscal well-being and needs to be tackled.
How do you do that? I don't know how the things organizationally work to have some sort of agreement developed.
Well, there are agreements, and for example, the OECD, which are the richer countries plus Mexico and Brazil and so on, they have done quite a lot of in sort of soft law, a lot of good work on trying to regulate, for example, the tax evasion that multinationals do. Mm-hmm. But developing countries have a limited voice in that, and they have wanted to shift this to the United Nations. Our friend Jose Antonio Campo heads a commission, which in the UN, which would involve all countries so they can benefit from these common rules. But in the end, I don't think the problems are really technical. It's a bit like with the Tobin Tax. It's more the pushback that you get from the big vested interests and their ability to evade things. If you introduce one measure, then they try to evade it. So you have to be very closely behind. But I think some progress has actually been made, but not clearly sufficient. But I would like to say that also again where we started, that if countries can increase taxation, although it's very difficult, particularly of the richer groups and the bigger companies, and they can develop their own domestic private capital markets and have public development banks, they will grow faster as the Asian countries did, East Asian countries, and also they will not depend so much on these volatile, fickle private capital flows that come from abroad and then they leave in bad times and accentuate problems. So I think taxation, domestic capital markets, and development banks are amongst the tools that are really important for developing countries to be able to accumulate their own domestic savings and channel them to kind of productive investment.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask about the big word, the word G, globalization, which is such a controversial matter. And I've heard people talking about how the result of the pandemic is going to be a reduction of globalization. Can you comment on that? Would that be a good thing or a bad thing, all told? I guess it maybe depends on whose shoes you're in at any one point in time. But I guess I'd like to hear your thoughts about the future of globalization.
Stephanie, you go first on this one.
It's a difficult one. I think there are different aspects to globalization, and some are better than others. I personally think that overall trade is probably a good thing, although it needs to be managed quite a lot.
Mm-hmm.
For example, to protect the people who suffer from increased trade. Even in developed countries, you have a lot of workers who have lost their jobs because they've had competition from cheaper products coming from developing countries. I mean, it's very good for developing countries, and the fact that China has been exporting a lot of goods has meant that poverty has really reduced in China dramatically. And at the same time, the Western consumers also benefited, including poorer people, because they got cheaper goods. But there were groups of workers in the developed countries that lost their jobs, the car industry, and steel industry, and so on. And so they needed to be compensated, and they needed for alternative investments to be made in their regions. And this was not done enough. And
would you say that was the basic cause of the support for Trump? Yeah. I've heard people say that. Do you think it's true?
I think there's a lot of truth in that, and there's a lot of truth in the support for Brexit, which came from these northern neglected areas, like in the US. And
the thing I just add to what Stephanie was saying, globalization isn't an on and off switch. It's possible to think of forms of globalization that are less disruptive and more mutually beneficial than the form that we have. And much of our conversation today has been talking about the financial side of globalization. And certainly I believe, and Stephanie would seem to agree, that more restrained form of financial flows would be a win-win proposition, both for developing countries and rich countries. So I go back to the immediate post-war period, the first 25 years after 1945, in which we had a restrained form of globalization, both in terms of capital flows and in terms of trade. And it worked very well. It was a period in which growth and equality were higher than they've ever been since or before. So it's something that is not simply a theoretical possibility, but we've seen practice of this in history. So as a model for how to deal with constrained globalization, I think I often look at the Nordic countries where they're open to globalization, but they're also active in labor markets to make sure that, workers who are displaced or disadvantaged have opportunities to reskill or retrain and move to other sectors. But in order to do that, you have to have a large and competent state, well-funded state that's able to intervene and help people in that way, as the Nordic countries seem to have figured out.
So it's a sort of managed globalization, which is managed for the good of the world economy, but also for the individual national countries, and which is more interventionist in things like finance, which can be so disruptive, and perhaps less so, but compensatory on trade. And of course, I think encouraging things like scientific exchanges, which are fantastic. I mean, a lot of the development of these vaccines has been done because scientists from all over the world are working together. So we both like a famous economist called John Maynard Keynes, and he said something like, let friendship and culture and science be international. But he said, using a bit a Gandhian expression, let capital be homespun, meaning, let most capital be homegrown.
He said that, huh? Oh, okay. I guess I never heard that. And you would take the same position that even ideally we're not looking to do more transnational financial management, but more national level reforms, or not?
What we're saying is, we should, where the globalization could be damaging to generally, like in a global financial crisis, or to particular nations, there should be restraint.
And how does that restraint happen?
It could be international restraint, but in practice, it's probably going to be national, like the case that Roy mentioned of Chile, the country where I grew up. They put capital controls on discouraging excessive flows. That's in practice how things happen. The Asian countries have done it also very effectively. And the Europeans did it in the 50s and 60s as well. And it worked very well. I think it's very important, this point that Roy made about how things worked well after the war. And partly it was recovery, pent-up demand. But also there was this consensus, for example, that employment should be the main aim of economic policy, not inflation control, not maximizing profits for the big multinationals, but jobs. And it was very effective in achieving that. Growth. So, if we can get consensus about the right policies, then you can get the right instruments to implement. The problem is that globalization has got a little bit out of hand, and it's created a little bit of these monsters, like, this very powerful financial sector, which then stops you doing the right measures for regulation and so on. But I think there comes a point when people get tired and they rebel against it. The problem is that it's not always a progressive answer. You mentioned rightly Trump. And of course, in the 30s, we had the terrible reactions of fascism and Nazism. But you can have a sort of, our dream is always Roosevelt, the progressive reforms that could have a more positive, if you like, civilization.
I think you two are on the same wavelength, and I would love to see a more explicit plan for how you would save the world financially, because the project I'm working on is called Project Save the World, and I always figure we have some saving to do, but I'm not going to be able to handle the financial end of things, so it's up to you.
Well, we just need another couple of these conversations and we'll have it all figured out.
All right. I'm up for that anytime you are. That's wonderful. I really appreciate this. And I think some people will learn as much as I did from it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us. It was really great.
Okay. I appreciate it. Bye.